When most people hear about inflation, they aren't too concerned because it's the way things have always been. Even when inflation is under control, the Federal Reserve has a target inflation rate of 2%. Central banks exist to cause inflation. Henry Ford once said, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." What was Henry Ford talking about? What is it that if people found out, there would be a revolution? It's actually quite simple. Allow me to show you an example. Hal's friend Tim asked him if he wanted to invest in Tim's new company called ABC Company. Hal said yes and agreed to put up 50% of the capital needed to start the business, so they became 50-50 business partners. Hal owned 50 shares and Tim owned 50 shares. Hal had a full-time job, so Tim ran the business. One day, without telling Hal, Tim decided to create 2 new shares of the business, and he kept them all for himself. Hal owned 50 shares and became owner of 49%. Tim owned 52 shares and became owner of 51%. Since Hal didn't notice, a year later, Tim decided to create 2 more shares, and again, he kept them for himself. Hal owned 50 shares and became owner of 48%. Tim owned 54 shares and became owner of 52%. Tim was emboldened by Hal's naivety, so the following year, he decided to create 5 new shares. Hal owned 50 shares and became owner of 45%. Tim owned 59 shares and became owner of 55%. The following year, he did the same. He wanted to do more, but he was worried that Hal might notice that although his amount of shares had stayed the same, his percentage ownership of the company was dwindling. Tim was greedy, but he didn't want to press his luck. Hal owned 50 shares and became owner of 43%. Tim owned 64 shares and became owner of 57%. One would think that Hal would notice what Tim was doing, but since the business was continuing to operate well and things seemed just fine, Hal didn't ever consider what was happening. No one had ever explained to Hal that a business partner could just magically create new shares without telling him, and he certainly didn't know what the effect of that would be. In the 5th year of business, Tim's greed, fueled by Hal's ignorance, had convinced Tim that he could create as many shares as he'd like. So he decided to create 10 more shares. Hal owned 50 shares and became owner of 40%. Tim owned 74 shares and became owner of 60%. By year 6, Hal began to question what was going on, but Tim told him that there was an emergency, and in order to save the company, he would need to print more shares, and better yet, he would even give Hal some shares too this time. Hal got 5 new shares. But Tim gave himself 20 new shares. So even though the number of Hal's shares went up, his ownership percentage went down. He had more shares, but actually owned less of the company. When year 7 came, the emergency had not passed, so Tim convinced Hal that the only way to save the company was by printing more shares, almost an additional 40% of shares. Hal received 5 more shares, while Tim received 55 shares. Hal was excited because when they started the company, he only had 50 shares, but now he had 60. Hal owned 60 shares and became owner of 28%. Tim owned 149 shares and became owner of 72%. By year 10, Hal was so proud that he now owned 100 shares of ABC Company. He had doubled his shares and felt very accomplished. What Hal didn't realize is that there were now 10,000 total shares of ABC Company. He originally owned 50% of the company, but now his shares, although they increased, only accounted for 1% ownership of the company. Hal was happy, although his story was actually quite sad. If Hal's story were true, he could sue Tim for fraud. Definition of fraud: wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. Now that we agree that this process is fraudulent, consider that this is exactly how central banks operate. This is precisely what Henry Ford was talking about. While the Fed creates new currency, you may hold the same amount, or you may even increase the amount of currency you hold, but you will never be able to keep up with their pace. The percentage of dollars you hold relative to all dollars in existence is less today than it was yesterday. It will be less tomorrow than it is today. And the day after that, and the day after that. This is why a fixed money supply system such as Bitcoin represents the world's first fair and balanced money system, free from the fraudulent practices of the Tims and central banks of the world. If you want to learn more about Bitcoin and why it is the fix for this broken system, read Bitcoin Evangelism by Brian DeMint. It offers an easy-to-understand explanation of what Bitcoin is, free from the hype and speculation of the talking heads. R. Buckminster Fuller said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete."